Good evening and welcome to the panel on No Defense. My name is Monica Lewis Patrick. I'm the president and CEO of We the People of Detroit, and I have the honor and privilege of being your moderator this evening for this film preview and this deep discussion. We'd like for you to submit any questions that you may have at DPTV Facebook page, the chat function, and YouTube channel. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network, We the People of Detroit, the Michigan Life Stage Environmental Exposures and Disease Center, Great Lakes Now, and Detroit Public Television. But before we get into the film and talk to our panelists, in 2010, the United Nations General Assembly formally recognized that access to clean, safe drinking water was a human right, and it was essential to the realization of all human rights. Safe water is defined by the World Health Organization as free from microorganisms, chemical substances, and radiological hazards that constitute a threat to a person's health. Contamination of water, including public waterways and drinking water sources, is a violation of the human right to clean water and a threat to public health. Over the last decade, we have become increasingly aware of the contamination of water systems, water sources through the US and globally with PFAS, a class of more than 7,000 chemicals used in a wide variety of commercial products. One important source of such contamination is firefighting foam, such as that used in Oscoda, Michigan, at the former Wart Smith Air Force Base, as well as hundreds of other U.S. military installations and commercial airports around the nation. The Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy estimates that there are more than 11,000 potential PFAS contaminants sites in our state. PFAS has been found in all of the Great Lakes, in numerous inland water bodies, and in public drinking water systems, so far serving approximately 2 million people in Michigan. A recent study found that it is literally raining PFAS across the Great Lakes, with exceptionally high levels in rain at remote locations like the Sleeping Bear sand dunes or in the urban centers like Chicago and Cleveland. In the United States, virtually everyone has PFAS in their blood, and it can be harmful even at extremely low levels. PFAS builds up in the body when consumed in drinking water, fish, and other products. It stays in the body for many years. That's why PFAS is often referred as the forever chemical. According to scientific research, adverse health effects in humans include effects on the immune system, certain cancers, disruption of the thyroid hormones, increased cholesterol levels, and reduced effectiveness of vaccines. Is that ringing clear right now in a global pandemic? The European Union has banned the use of all PFAS by 2030. In contrast, PFAS chemicals are unregulated by the United States government. In Michigan, only 7 of more than 7,000 PFAS chemicals are subject to regulation. Water is a public trust, a public good. As such, access to clean and safe water must be centered within a framework of preserving and maintaining the public's health. Contamination of water supplies and water sources, such as the widespread contamination of water with PFAS across the United States, is a violation of that public trust. And it's a threat to public health. The film No Defense, the U.S. military's war on water, details the widespread contamination of Oscoda, Michigan's water, wildlife, and national resources. It looks at the exposure of military personnel to high levels of high damaging PFAS from firefighting foam. It describes health and life impacts of those that were exposed. It notes that the U.S. Department of Defense is the largest PFAS polluter in the country, and that the Defense Department has played a significant role in preventing the federal government from issuing PFAS regulations. Tonight, We are fortunate to have, as members of our panel, some of the great voices that are leading on this issue in the nation. We have with us tonight attorney Anthony Tony Spinola, a consultant for the film, a member of the Need Our Water Now group in Oscoda, Michigan. We also have Craig Minor, a retired United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the father of Mitchell Minor, featured in the film. And then we have the legendary filmmaker herself, a Pulitzer Prize winner, the journalist, filmmaker, Sarah Gannon. Let's take a look at the clip.
How many fish a year do you think you take out of the lake?
Thousands, easily.
Is that how you grew up, living off the land?
Yeah, we never had much. We were always kind of poor.
When you first heard about the contamination out here,
It upset us because we knew that we had already eaten so many things out of this area. Mom's actually had cancer for 2 years now. I don't remember as a kid hearing about cancer everywhere, whereas nowadays I do. It seems like everybody I know is suffering.
All right, give me this arm.
Went and saw the pediatrician and then just said, well, your son's going to be mentally and physically handicapped.
We were completely overwhelmed by everything. Our entire world was upset. We never knew there were toxic chemicals in the groundwater and the well water there. We have over 400 bases where this stuff was laid out on the ground.
Pfas is a family of toxic chemicals. We call them forever chemicals. We think the DoD probably is the biggest user of these chemicals that have caused widespread pollution. There's actually leaked emails that came out from the White House saying this is going to be a public relations disaster if we allow the actual health information to come out.
They had accidental discharges of the PFAS foam, so I had to basically crawl out through the mountain of foam. I've been married twice, and we never were able to conceive.
did it impact your marriages?
It's pretty much ruined them.
Give me an idea of when the Air Force understood that there was PFAS in the foam.
Well, they knew that from the beginning. There is no plan right now, and there's no timeline even in place to have a plan.
This is where the second most contaminated fish in the world was pulled from.
These are the poster child for everything that's wrong with our environmental protection in this country.
The Department of Defense refuses to clean up this groundwater, even though they fully acknowledge that their actions created this pollution.
There is no doubt, as we stand here on this lake, that it is in violation of Michigan law.
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind at all.
Could you tell me what you would like from the Air Force?
Acknowledgement that they knew the chemicals were there and they failed to inform people. I don't feel like that they caused me to poison my son.
Wow. I've seen it several times now, and it's still always just hard to watch what the people of Oscoda and many of your families are going through and have gone through. But I want to take a couple of minutes and just have each one of you sort of introduce yourselves to our audience and the people we're going to be talking to this evening. And so if we could maybe start with you, Sarah, and just tell us about yourself and what motivated you to make this film.
Thanks, Monica. Hi, everyone who's listening. Thanks for being here tonight. Thank you especially to the University of Michigan for hosting this discussion. It's been more than a year and a half since we premiered No Defense in Ann Arbor. And like everything else during the pandemic, we unexpectedly had to sort of toss out all of our plans for showing the film in communities across the country. So this has been a really great week where we felt like we were able to reach people again. And so I want to thank our sponsors for making that happen, to UM for hosting this, and of course to Tony and Craig for being here with me, and Monica. So thrilled that you're hosting. Your work is amazing. And I'm excited to hear from everyone and to talk to everyone.
Well, we're going to have an amazing conversation. But can you talk just a little bit, Sarah, about your motivation for making the film?
Yeah, of course. I first visited Van Enten Lake thinking that maybe I would write something about ongoing PFAS contamination at military bases. But it didn't take very long for me to realize that this was not a little something. And so I felt like it was also something that couldn't just be told with words alone. You know, standing on the public beach and seeing the foam lap up just feet from the playground. And it immediately told me the story of what was happening there. And, you know, as a new mom at the time, I wanted to make sure that I could show the world, not just tell people what I was seeing. And so that's why we made No Defense into a film. And it's also why we chose to focus our stories on people who are impacted, because, you know, I'm sure many of you have experienced this. Political stories, scientific stories, they're not just stories about chemicals and numbers and legislation or lack of laws or lack of regulation. Stories about how contamination and failure and to clean it up affects actual lives, real people. And so I always feel like those stories can get lost from these narratives. And I felt like that was getting lost from the narrative in Oscoda. And so that's why we wanted to make No Defense about people, and we wanted to make it into a film.
Thanks so much, Sarah. We're excited to have you with us this evening. Next, can we go to Tony? Tony, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do and why you do what you do?
Sure, Monica, thank you. It's an honor to be here with you, and special thanks to the University of Michigan and the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network, We the People of Detroit, and Detroit Public Television. And I want to start by giving, again, a real special thank you to Sarah Ganem and her team, Lenny Boren, and the rest. They have just been absolutely phenomenal. And it's always interesting when someone comes to tell a story about your community, and then you sit down and you watch it for the first time, and wow, what an amazing job they've done. I became involved in this whole PFAS thing. It kind of goes back to March of 2016 when I picked up the Detroit Free Press one morning in the height of the Flint water crisis, and saw a headline that said that Michigan's next water crisis or something like that is in northern Michigan. And I thought, oh boy, that doesn't look good. And then I looked at the picture that they had with the headline, and there was our lake, Van Etten Lake, where my family's had a home for years and years, up in Oscoda. We were initially assured that things were okay, and then 6 months later, we received a notice saying you shouldn't be drinking your water. And I certainly know the people of Flint know how that feels. It's really a kind of a bizarre and surreal experience. And I attended my first meeting in October of 2016, and I came away thinking that, well, it looks like they have this under control, and it looks like they're doing all the right things. And within a matter of weeks, it became apparent to me that the actions weren't matching the words. That the problem, the more questions I asked, the deeper it appeared that the problem was, and the more it became apparent to me that the United States government, through the U.S. Department of Defense, was not serious about trying to protect public health and protect our water and protect our community. And likewise, that the state of Michigan, although it was paying lip service and actually did a few good things in the beginning, it really wasn't committed to doing that as well. And so it became obvious to me that we had to stand up and advocate for ourselves. So that's how I became involved. And then my friends and neighbors in Oscoda, we all came together, and sort of the rest is history. So it's a long story, but it's really gratifying to know that we have people, Monica, like you, who are interested in this issue, and Craig and his family, and of course Sarah and her crew. It's just been amazing. So thank you to everyone.
Well, thanks so much, Tony. You know that you brought the issue of PFAS into my life. I had never even heard the phrase until I met you as we were on the battlefield for water affordability and water quality. And so I just always have to thank you for broadening my understanding that all of these water struggles are connected. And then next, we'll have another friend of mine. I hadn't seen him in a couple of years, but Craig Miner, who is just a great dad and a great public servant and a hero of mine. Craig, can you just introduce yourself to our audience and talk a little bit about what's brought you to this table, to this issue of fighting against PFAS?
Sure. Thanks again for letting me be a part of this. And I represent our son Mitchell, who passed away about 3 months after filming was complete. And we miss our boy. We love him dearly. And my wife is off somewhere right now taking care of our youngest son as he moves into his new home. So I'm here by myself. But we were one day 4 or 5 years ago sitting in our living room, and suddenly the news flashed up and said all these Air Force bases that had some sort of poisoning, and we saw Wurtsmith Air Force Base on that list, and that was our first clue that there was something wrong. See, Mitchell was profoundly handicapped, as you saw in the movie. He couldn't sit up or roll over. He was equivalent to a 6-month-old, both physically and mentally. And he, when he was born, we didn't notice it right off the bat, but he was so profoundly handicapped that everybody thought maybe the reason was some sort of virus or some genetic thing. Well, we checked on those things, and those weren't the cause, and so we never knew. And so somewhere along the line, about 2015, we really felt compelled to tell our story, and we wrote a book about Mitchell and our lives and what this chemical had done to us. And that's how Sarah and Tony and others discovered us, because we had a common thing, the poisoning at Wurtsmith. And I'd like to just add, I know that everybody's focusing on the chemicals that are in the ground at the old site of Wurtsmith Air Force Base, and it's leaving the base. It's impacting people, but it impacted warriors, fellow warriors, and families many years ago on the bases. So back when during the Cold War, Wurtsmith Air Force Base was the battlefield, and people were poisoned. Matter of fact, the chemicals during the time we were there were actually poured right off the trucks and cleaned all the equipment within a few hundred feet of the wells that collected the entire water for the base, sent it up in the water tower, and distributed it to everybody. And we've calculated that my PFAS, based on what's in me now, was about 5 million parts per trillion back when I left the base. So all that to say is that's our family involvement in this, and we're thankful to be here, and we love you guys.
Well, I appreciate you, Craig. You know, I come from a military family and understand just that great sacrifice and service. And I just can't say enough about what you've not only done as a family, but what you've done to really elevate this issue and make sure people understand how important they know that Mitchell was to all of us, and how important he's going to continue to be to this story around why we've got to get PFAS out of our water.
Yeah.
But let's get into our panel discussion, because I want people to hear from you, and then I want us to be able to answer some questions. And so, Sarah, can we start with you? Just as we start looking at this film, and No Defense, it tells a powerful story about Americans who are fighting against one of the largest known polluters in the country, the United States military. Can you tell us about how you were able to navigate the complexity of telling that story and still being able to safely make sure that people got your message, that it wasn't hidden or buried under bureaucracy?
Yeah, I think that is the biggest challenge, just the vast nature of the story. And it's complicated. There's a lot of science to learn and digest. And as a journalist, you always want to sort of walk that very thin line of not necessarily dumbing it down, but telling the story to people in a way that they're actually going to understand. Because if you don't achieve that, then you might as well have told them nothing at all. So that, that's always challenging with a story that sort of has a foundation in science. There's also a lot of twists and turns in the timeline of this story, a lot of things that have happened over many years. And there's a lot of context to bring to all of that, why those things may have happened the way they did. Tony mentioned how Flint really helped bring this to the surface. The initial report from an official inside the Michigan government came before Flint, but it went nowhere until the nation really kind of woke up to the necessity of understanding water quality. And that happened because of Flint. So, there's a lot of context to bring to all of this. And also, I really wanted to make sure, as I've said, that we told stories of actual people and not just the story of politics and science. And so you got to make room for that. You got to let people meet characters and understand their importance and understand why their lives are so deeply impacted. And that takes time and space to emotionally connect with people. So that's like, a lot of stuff, because I've been talking probably for 3 or 4 minutes and I'm just explaining what the film is, not
No,
actually,
you're fine.
telling
You're
it.
fine. We want to know, because there's a complexity to telling this story, and it's so critical to sort of be able to pick your brain in terms of how you're able to take what people are feeling and draw out all of these emotions. Because I find myself crying every time I watch it. So to be able to do that and express that emotion, we hope is going to change hearts and minds about PFAS. So thank you, Sarah. Next, can we go to Tony? Tony, can we talk a little bit about just not only the work that you've done on behalf of PFAS, but I just think it's important to sort of lift your personal story of how deeply connected you are to this place and space, and why that story too was a critical part of what needed to be told. Because we know sometimes when people go up north and they have these sort of what we consider summer getaways, the people that actually live there can feel left out. So can you talk about that connection and how important it was to tell that story?
Yeah, my wife in particular and her family have been going to Oscoda, had a place in Oscoda since the 1960s. And it was a very deep family connection. Her father was a veteran himself, served in the Korean War, and bought the place on Van Etten Lake as a place to bring his entire family together. And as the generations, unfolded, they began to spread out across the country. So it became a gathering spot for everyone in our family whenever they came to Michigan, and those of us who lived here as well. And when we and they learned about this problem in the lake, not just our drinking water, but in the lake that really is a part of and the heart and soul of the community and of our experience there, it was a real gut punch, just a real gut punch. And then for people in the area who, and Sarah does just an absolutely magnificent job of telling their stories. It for me became a very personal thing, because so many people were impacted in such significant ways and felt for the longest time that they didn't have a voice, that there was really nothing that could be done, particularly this little tiny community of just a few thousand people where there's really no media outlets. And it's really a getaway place for most of the rest of the state. So for me, it became one of those things, in part in honor of the service of my father-in-law and how important it was for him and his family, not to back down, but to stand up, to bring in our elected officials, and to hold the Air Force and the other parties involved accountable. And so for me, it turned into that. It turned into something that's about, again, rooted in our family and aimed at bringing something good from this really bad situation.
Definitely. And just thank you so much, because it demonstrated too some family values that that's standing up and speaking up, that we're hoping that others will emulate as we continue to share this story about PFAS. And so, Craig, that brings us to you. Can you tell us or talk to us about Mitchell? It's just so important that our audience knows about Mitchell and his life, and this amazing book that you have written to really celebrate his life. I just think it's so important that our audience hears about Overwhelmed, the civilian casualty of Cold War poisoning, Mitchell's memoirs as told by his dad, mom, sister, and brother?
Sure. Yeah, that book now is available on Amazon, and it's an ebook also, and an audiobook as well. But it's about our son Mitchell. Gosh, what can I tell you? That he changed our lives in ways that I just cannot explain. We're a stronger family. We love the Lord, our God. We love our children, our son, and that's kind of our testimony in life. Mitchell was when he was born, we didn't quite notice that he was handicapped. It took 6 months before we discovered it, and it was pretty traumatic. We immediately left Wurtsmith and ended up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where we're still attached to today. And he, like I told you before, he was so profoundly handicapped. He couldn't sit up, roll over. He was a quadriplegic in every sense of the word, and he couldn't talk. We had to tube feed him. He had severe seizures, scary seizures, and it was his entire life was just ministering to us while laying in a bed for 30 years. And he had the most wonderful smile, and we just love him dearly. I have a hard time watching the no defense thing. It hits so close. I cry every time, and so we just miss him.
Wow. Thank you, Craig. Thank you. I think it's so important that everybody knows about Mitchell. He's just been a wonderful, wonderful light throughout this entire story, and I appreciate you and your wife and your daughter and son for sharing that story with all of us. And so we're going to actually take a couple of minutes and go to another clip of the film, No Defense.
2010 was when I first learned about PFAS, and it just so happened we were working on Wurtsmith at the time. I was on a national committee of other people in my position that do these Defense Department sites. And they showed us this hangar, and they said, yeah, the fire suppression system went off, and this whole building was filled right to the top with foam. So that was my introduction to firefighting foams. And so I had this hangar in my mind.
In his job as a government geologist, Bob Delaney was wrapping up 15 years of negotiating with the Air Force over how to clean up the more traditional contaminants, those that are expected at a base, like jet fuel. He thought they'd finally found a good plan for Wurtsmith when his consultant called him.
He sees this black soil 2 foot down. So I said, all right, sample it for everything, analyze it for everything, and while you're at it, see if you can find a lab that does these firefighting foams. And so we started sampling the groundwater, and because of the hangar incident, I knew, well, it's not going to just be at the fire training area, it's probably going to be all over. By the time we were done, we had sampled wells all across the base, and we hadn't found any that didn't have it in it. So it was like a shocker. I'd never seen anything like that.
Wow. Sarah, we know from this clip that Bob Delaney says that he's discovered PFAS at Wurtsmith and that it was a shocker. In the film, you tell the story about the report that Bob delivered to his bosses in the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality in 2012. In it, he says that PFAS was likely a widespread public health crisis in Michigan and that the rest of the country could possibly be at risk as well. And he laid out a blueprint for attacking it. Can you tell us what happened to the report and what happened to Bob?
Well, I think that Bob would tell you that he was ignored and that his report was largely ignored. And over the years that followed, he was treated the same way that many whistleblowers are treated. They're treated as traitors instead of as leaders. And I think Bob would agree that his government career suffered somewhat for what he wrote. And his warnings definitely did not reach the people who could have been helped, not for many, many years.
Well, thank you so much for that, because we think it's important, too, that people understand sometimes when you do the right thing, it's not always immediately rewarded. But I do think folks need to constantly lift up and probe the story of Bob Delaney, because he too has been another champion in this struggle against PFAS. Tony, do you know, I know you know Bob as well, and at the point in the film, there's a story about how you put him on the spot. Tell us about that, and tell us about the impact of Bob's work on PFAS.
Sure. Well, first, that's the question of his impact. Bob Delaney is really a true hero. If it hadn't been for him, if it hadn't been for his, first of all, inquiring mind, there are so many people in positions like his who would have seen that stained soil and really said, oh, there's nothing we can do about it. Not only did he pursue it, he connected the dots in that report. If it weren't for him, we would probably not be talking about PFAS at all in Michigan. And there's a very good chance the Department of Defense wouldn't be talking about it either, because in the very early stages, Bob went to the Department of Defense and actually convinced the department to start testing its various installations for PFAS. So his work is just, the impact is immeasurable. And yeah, I did put him on the spot in 2017. I came to understand that some testing had been done up in Oscoda that wasn't being released to the public. I found out about it by accident, and I didn't know Bob real well at the time, but he had a reputation for being a real honest, straight shooter. And so I just called him up and I said, hey, I've heard about these tests that are being done. Will you share the results with me? And when I asked that question, I knew that he could potentially get in trouble for doing it. And he took a long, and Sarah talks about it in the film, he took a long pause and took a deep sigh. And then he said, he thought about it and he said, you're a taxpayer. You've paid for this report, these reports, so I will send them to you. Shortly after he did that, he was banned from sending any of that type of information to anyone else. But the fact that he gave it to me was a catalyst for letting our community know and getting the word out that PFAS contaminated foam, which I think we'll see a little bit more of in some other clips in this, was a huge, huge problem in Oscoda, something that we needed to pursue. And again, without him, it never would have happened.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you so much. Well, we know the Minor family had tremendous courage to share all that had happened and all that you've gone through with the rest of us. Can we go to a scene in the film where it shares your story?
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Mitchell. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday. Big boy. You can't have any pizza, sorry.
It was May, the Friday before Mother's Day, and went and saw the pediatrician. He came in, laid Mitchell down, took his clothes off, checked his diapers, asked me questions about my pregnancy, and then just kind of nonchalantly said, well, your son's going to be mentally and physically handicapped. Of course, I started crying uncontrollably.
They tested us genetically to see if there was a genetic cause and decided that wasn't it. Then they said, well, the only thing it could be then is a virus. No one considered or even pondered the fact that there might be a chemical caused from a toxic chemical. Just wasn't even considered. Matter of fact, up until a year and a half ago, we never knew there were toxic chemicals in the groundwater and the well water there.
Craig, I know that you and your wife often talk about Mitchell, and we've already sort of mentioned him already. But can you talk to us a little bit about the impact that this has had on your family?
Oh my
The
word!
Your other children, your wife, yourself.
Yeah, I tell you, it's all in the book, and our lives are literally an open book. Boy, it was so devastating. It took the first 5 years to discover just how profoundly handicapped he was, and that we weren't going to be able to live a normal life when we had to transition to wheelchairs and hospital beds and special machinery. And I have to tell you, Carrie along with my daughter, and they did all the caregiving for Mitchell, and it was spectacular. Mitchell, for 30 years, laid in a hospital bed in a wheelchair, and never once did he ever have a bed sore. Never. And nurses would cry when they'd see that. So yeah, it's impacted our family in ways that I can't even begin to describe. But we know where our boy is now. So
Yes, definitely, definitely. Thank you. Well, Sarah, you tell this story of others who've suffered serious health issues that may be tied to PFAS, and you even included a series of short video clips from the impacted veterans and civilians all across the country. Do you see any common themes in these stories, and if so, what are they?
Well, I think the theme, and not to keep giving the same answer here, but the theme is that people continue to be ignored about their concerns. So it's not just people like Bob Delaney, but communities cannot get adequate funds for cleanup. Veterans are having trouble getting benefits for their medical issues. Some of them are even having trouble getting tested in the first place, and can't know if their medical issues are potentially linked to their exposure. In general, civilians, the general public, and of course, veterans and their families are just having an incredibly hard time getting answers for why this remains a problem and why people were exposed for so long.
Well, thank you for continuing to tell these stories because, as I stated earlier, as a child of two combat veterans, I do understand the complexities of why people don't have services and how complicated it is to get those services. But then to have on top of it your own government poisoning you just has to be another layer of devastation. And
That's definitely something I've heard over and over from people. Specifically from veterans and their family, from veterans themselves, that they, they feel betrayed by this issue. They feel like they gave their all, they risked their lives and the potential that they may not come home and that their family may have to go on without them, only to sort of not see that in return when when issues like this arise. They feel like their medical issues aren't being addressed. They're not even being taken seriously. And in the most unfortunate cases, the miners case, but there are many others too, people who went overseas and served, fearing that the worst case scenario was that they wouldn't come home, then came home to find their family members sick and dying. And those who lost family members, I think, are feeling the most betrayed.
thank you, Sarah. So, Tony, you've been dealing with the Air Force and the state on PFAS and Oscoda for over a decade. How has the community been impacted, and how has the community reacted to all of this?
Yeah, well, in terms of the impacts on the community, we are subject in Oscoda to 5 separate public health warnings. In a certain area, you can't drink the water. For a 9-mile stretch of the Osable River, it's unsafe to eat even a single fish. Just one fish is hazardous in that area. Hunters and fishermen and outdoorsmen are advised not to eat venison within a radius of the base. They're advised not to eat small game and other semi-aquatic wildlife in what is the most highly contaminated PFAS zone in the entire Great Lakes region. And then we have this surface water foam that's pretty much everywhere on Van Etten Lake and even Lake Huron that we've been advised not even to touch. So that's a pretty major set of impacts. And the community, I think, initially, as these things started rolling out, the first warning came back in 2012 with fish in the Osable. The community, I think, originally trusted the Air Force. The Air Force had been a welcome partner in the community. There were many veterans who lived in Oscoda, settled there, and people trusted the Air Force to do the right thing. As time progressed, as these one after the other of these warnings continued to be issued, and nothing was getting done, the community, there was a shift. I remember early on, someone said to me, well, this community is never going to really do anything against the Air Force. Well, that proved not to be accurate, because the Air Force has been so unwilling to proactively attack this problem, and they have given so many different stories at so many different times. The common theme there is don't take them for anything that they have to say, watch what they do, and what they have to do is really pretty much nothing. So the community, and every community has different voices and different sources, and there are some who think that this is much ado about nothing, but there are many others who feel that, like me, who feel that we need to stand up and we need to let people know that Oscoda is having a serious problem, and that it, as the first base that was found in the world, there are others all around the country where this is happening. So it's a pretty ominous message.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much. We're going to take a few minutes and go to our next clip, and then we're going to come back, and we're also going to take some questions from our Facebook chat page, and also for those that are joining us on our social media pages. So if we can take to the clip, Great Lakes Now.
There is currently no federal standard for PFAS in surface water, but states have set their own rules. In 2020, Michigan adopted some of the strictest standards in the country, limiting 7 of the thousands of PFAS compounds to low levels. But the Air Force says it isn't bound by Michigan's rules under CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. They say they're only required to meet the EPA's much higher health advisory limit of 70 parts per trillion. And they say testing shows undetectable levels of PFAS anyway.
With PFAS and PFOA, the Lifetime Health Advisory allows us to consider under Section 104 of CERCLA this to be an other pollutant and take some action. The action level is 70 because of the EPA Health Advisory. The result is non-detect because that's what the technology gives us.
PFAS is detectable in Van Etten Lake, which borders the base. In the summer of 2017, white foam started showing up along the beaches. Tests confirmed it contained high levels of PFAS.
It's not as concentrated of a problem as out here in Clark's Marsh, but there's a lot more human interaction with the environment there, so that makes that a big problem too. And obviously the foam is kind of a scary thing to people, but because you can see it more, but it's firefighting foam basically. It's a dilute firefighting foam.
For reasons I can't explain, the foam that's showing up on our surface waters is getting worse. So there are times when you can see the foam piling up and blowing into yards. It's exposing children and animals and ourselves to this, foam that we could possibly touch, and it has high levels of PFAS in it.
Kathy Woosterbarth has lived in Oscoda all her life. She's co-leader of a community action group called NOW, Need Our Water.
On this beach here, I was a lifeguard for 3 years, so I spent a lot of time in this water, and I believe that I may have been affected. I developed cancer a few years after I worked in this location, along with an immunological disease. So it's possible that PFAS had a contributing factor to that.
So Tony, as you're working on PFAS, and I know that work is taking you all across the nation, can you talk about the environmental justice issue in Oscoda and tell us about that and about the connection you see to the environmental justice issues in like a Detroit and a Flint and how people are dealing with that?
Yeah, I think in Oscoda, the environmental justice aspect of this is often overlooked. As many environmental justice communities know, the people who are most heavily impacted are often those, and that's the case in Oscoda, who live below the poverty line, who are just trying to make ends meet, and who don't have a lot of options. I think there's a portion in the film where Sarah talks to one of the people impacted, and she said, "So you're basically stuck, right?" And he says, "Yeah, pretty much that's the case." So in Oscoda, it's really easy for regulators to come in and say, well, don't eat the fish, just go to the grocery store and pick up something else. Well, when you can't afford to go to the grocery store, that isn't an option. We also see in Oscoda, and again, Sarah does a wonderful job of describing this in the film, there's a youth camp that's owned by the YMCA of Metropolitan Detroit. And it's a place where kids from Detroit, Flint, and other urban centers come to enjoy the great outdoors in the north. And that camp sits right on top of a PFAS flume, and nothing's being done to address it. So, and we don't have money in the community for the community itself to tackle the problem. So, yeah, it's a huge environmental justice issue in Oscoda. And Monica, you and I have talked before. Just like we have the foam in Oscoda, you've got it in Detroit. Just like we have people, there are times when the city, the municipality has been able to extend water lines into certain areas. We have people who can't afford to connect. We have people who can't afford to pay the water bill, so they don't do it. And their choice then, the only choice they're left with is to drink contaminated water. And so I think that PFAS is a really incredible issue that can unite those of us, whether we live in Oscoda, we live in Detroit, whether we live in any other part of this region or parts of the country. We can come together and break down barriers that are really artificial, that are based on things like race and geography and socioeconomic status. This is a bit of an equal opportunity destroyer in PFAS. It impacts those who live below the poverty line most heavily, but it's an opportunity for us to really start to draw attention to water issues all across our nation.
Amen, Tony. And you know that I agree with you 300% on that. And thank you, because you've been just a major connector and champion for being able to bridge that understanding that it's not just one water issue, but it's all the water issues, and we've all got to get involved. And so, Craig, it brings me back to you, my friend. What would you say to other veterans and their families who are encountering the type of health problems that you and your family have suffered and struggled through?
Well, I would say first, you need to know what poisoned you. We all know about the burn pits in Iraq and Agent Orange and those tragic stories, but those happened on foreign soil, and this happened on U.S. soil, and not only impacted veterans, but it impacted your family, your wives, your children. This is horrific, and you need to know what has happened, and you need to get active and ask the military, the Department of Defense, to do the right thing, because this is clearly in the soil. It's clearly in the Van Etten Lake, and it's clearly in the Sable River and the areas in heavy concentrations. And guess what? It's in heavy concentrations in many of the veterans that are listening to this right now, and then people we need to get the story out.
Thanks, Craig. Thank you. So speaking of Van Etten Lake, Sarah, I know that you've seen firsthand the foam. You know what it looks like, and you know that concern that community has when they see it. What was your reaction, and how did it shape your decision to make this movie, No Defense?
Yeah, I mean, really the foam and seeing the foam on my very first visit is the reason that this film was made. It's such a visual reminder, and you don't often get that in covering water stories. In Flint, for example, it was an invisible danger, right? You could not see, taste, or smell the danger in the water when you turned on the tap. But in Oscoda and in military bases like it, where you see PFAS foam physically surfacing, it's this immediate reminder of what's happening. And I thought that was so unique, that you have this unique opportunity to show people, not just tell people why this is important and what's happening to a community. And so I really felt very strongly that we needed to do that we needed to make it in a visual format and tell it in the form of a film. for that reason, because it was jarring for me to see it, and I wanted other people to feel that way too, because reaching people emotionally is the way that you can reach people from an impact, and make an impact. And so, that typical storytelling, aim for the heart, it's true. It really works. If you want people to get on board, you have to aim for the heart. And so I felt that people would immediately get it. They would immediately understand the problem if they could see what I could see.
And thank you for that, Sarah, because also can you speak to the fact that with PFAS, in terms of its infusion within the water system, that you can't taste it, that normally you can't see it, right? That
Right.
this rarity of it bubbling up and surfacing.
It's an interesting and unique problem with water quality issues. With a lot of infrastructure issues are visible. You can see when your roads are crumbling, and you feel it in your wallet because your tires need to be changed more often, right? When bridges collapse, like we see them. You see when something needs repair. But a lot of times water quality issues are invisible. Pipes are underground. Chemicals are, it's not immediately clear there are chemicals in your water. There are a couple of times I've covered stories where the water turned a color, right? And it was an immediate sign to people that there was some sort of danger. I can remember back in the early days of fracking, people lighting flame underneath their faucet as a way of showing that something was wrong, something was amiss. But oftentimes this is an invisible problem, and it makes it easier for politicians to ignore it. It makes it easier for the polluter to get away with it. And it just overall hides the issue from the public eye and from the people that it is, the people that it's impacting. So having that visual reminder with the foam, especially on a public beach, on a lake, a beautiful lake, like, a place that you would want to bring your family if there was otherwise no contamination problem. I thought, that was a window that I felt, gave us a window into telling the story in a way that would reach people.
I think you did an amazing job of doing that, because as I stated, every time I see it, I cry. And so, Tony, as we talk about this interaction with the Air Force and the military, one of the things that we keep hearing is the Air Force says that it doesn't have to comply with Michigan PFAS regulations, that it doesn't have to, it doesn't affect them. They don't have to take a position. So can you talk about that and explain that to us? Because it makes no sense to me.
It makes no sense to me either, Monica. But I would first say to you that, and I've said this before, with all due respect to the Air Force, dealing with them on this issue is like dealing with a used car salesman. They will pretty much say or do anything at any time to justify whatever level of inaction they're currently trying to justify. Back in 2017 in Oscoda, they were on the hot seat for not complying with another Michigan law, and they actually wrote a letter to the Michigan Senate Fiscal Agency and said, "Hey, leave us alone on this one, but we promise you," and I'm reading from this letter right now, "the Air Force is working closely with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality to comply with Michigan laws and regulations applicable to the federal government." And they go on to say, and we're working to ensure that we're complying at Clark's Marsh, which is one of the scenes in the film and one of the most contaminated places in the Great Lakes. Well, as soon as the Air Force figured out that actually walking the walk on those words would mean spending a lot of money, not just in Oscoda, but all across the country, all of a sudden that tune changed. And it was like, well, we don't know if these regulations apply. And then they finally coalesced around, well, we have sovereign immunity from complying with state laws. And sooner or later, we'll get around to deciding if maybe they're applicable under CERCLA, but that's not coming for years and years and years down the road. We think they're wrong. We think they're wrong legally. We think they're wrong from a public trust standpoint. And what's happening now, it's been going on in Oscoda for 4 or 5 years. We've been fighting this fight with them, but it's now happening in other places around the country. I was just in Massachusetts last week. The Mashpee Water District on Cape Cod is having to comply with state law to clean up its drinking water for that municipality. And the drinking water is being contaminated by the Air Force, and the Air Force the city is saying to the Air Force, pay us because we've got to clean up our water system. And the Air Force is saying, go fly a kite. That's just wrong. It's not fair. And it's really put the Air Force in a position that is really untenable in terms of dealing with the political folks in Congress. And I think sooner or later, the chickens are going to come home to roost. Unfortunately, the more we delay, the more the impact hits. So long and the short of it is, yeah, they should comply. And yeah, they haven't been upfront about the fact that they need to.
Wow. So what happened to our honor code, huh?
Exactly.
Wow. So Craig, in your work, you've studied the PFAS groundwater plumes at Wordsmith. How is drinking water on the base impacted by those plumes?
Oh, my word. Well, after looking at Bob Delaney's reports and then cross-referencing them with when wells were put in place and when they were servicing the base, became very clear that this PFAS, this firefighter foam, was practically dumped right over the wells, and so it was going right into the tap water. And as you mentioned earlier, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. It's clear. Boy, it went into the bodies of everybody who drank it on base, and guess what? Once it goes in, it's very hard for it to go out, and it just builds up and builds up. It doesn't take very long at all. 3 years that you have your tenure at a military base, and it's filled up your bloodstream. So it's all over. And when you look at Bob Delaney's work and you compare it to all the activities that were going on base, people were drinking this stuff just in spades. Horrible.
Wow. Whew. Well, we asked you guys a lot of questions, but we have a lot of questions that are coming in, not only in our chat, but through our social media, Facebook Live. And so if it's all right with you, I'd like to begin to take a few of those questions. And so we have our first one, we don't have a name. So our anonymous person here says, how can the public help in the fight for PFAS and become more involved in the fight for clean water? How can the average person make an impact? Tony, you want to take that one?
I sure do. I go back to a time in Oscoda when that very question was presented. A group of us were sitting around in a room, and one person said, why doesn't the government just do the right thing? The answer to that is the government only does the right thing when the people who elect the elected officials speak up. And what people in Oscoda have learned, and I think it's an incredible lesson in participatory democracy to see what's happened there. They have learned that when you do speak up, when you contact your elected officials and you let them know, A, you got a problem, B, you're concerned about it, and C, here are some solutions. It's amazing. It takes some time, but it's amazing how they begin to pay attention. And as you do that, and as people around the country join in, all of a sudden, I mean, I can remember in 2016, nobody knew about PFAS. I went up to Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and people were looking at me like, well, what's PFAS? Well, within the matter of a year or so, going back there, I had people coming to me saying, what can I do? How can we address this legislatively? And it's because ordinary citizens stood up and demanded action. We're fortunate in Oscoda that we have Congressman Dan Kildee, who navigated through the Flint water crisis as our congressman, and he's been a tremendous help. But going back, and what he said to us from the very beginning was, I can't do this alone. I need your help. I need you to tell me what's happening to you, and I need you to stand up with me in this fight. And so people out there who are wondering what can you do, call your elected officials. Contact the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network. We're a statewide agency or a statewide network of organizations. We'll have some contact information later, but there's incredible power in the voices of the people. So stand up and be heard.
Thanks so much for that, Tony. And you're right, the Great Lakes PFAS Network is a critical part of lifting those voices around this fight to ensure the human right to water and especially removing PFAS. Craig, can you tell us how you test for PFAS in blood and how we can do that on an individual basis?
Sure. So about a year ago, we found a company. There really isn't many, and we can provide the information for those companies that do this. But we went on our own dime. I think it was cost us about $800 each, my wife and I, to test. And we had our blood drawn by our local doctor, and then had that sent off. And so it comes back with some with good results. It tells you what you need to know about the PFAS that's in your blood. It's multifaceted, so it's not just PFOS and PFOA, PFNA. It breaks down all the different things that are in your blood because each one does have a different health effect. So, but that there is a way to do that.
Is there something specific that people should be asking for when they're engaging their doctor around asking for this blood test?
Well, I'll tell you this, is that the minute you go to doctors, even VA doctors, they look at you like, what are you talking about? Because when doctors handle sicknesses, they don't handle chemical poisoning. And even blood doctors that I've gone to, they look at me and just tilt their heads. They say, well, we don't handle that stuff. And they say, well, who does? And they say, well, toxicologists, evidently. But you get with them, they don't even really know about the PFOS or PFOA. So this is part of the problem is that this entire chemical that's just spreading in the ground and people are still drinking today, and that has destroyed lives in the past. There's just this huge ignorance, and more people need to request to have their blood checked so that they know how much is in there. I will tell you this one other thing real quick is that what they'll tell you is hey, don't bother testing because we can't do anything about it. That's the tagline. It says it right in the Veteran Administration websites and government websites. But I'm telling you, you want to go get it tested because you want to have a date time stamp on the concentration that's in your blood, because you can calculate backwards and figure out what your toxicity level was when you were at peak poisoning. So don't take that advice. Get it tested. Find a way. And some doctors may pay for it, or insurances may pay for it, but that's not been what we've discovered.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks so much for that. We have a question from Rod, and his question is the Nature Conservancy supporting the efforts for accountability from the EPA and the Department of Defense? You want me to repeat it?
Would you please?
Yes, sir. Is the Nature Conservancy supporting the efforts for accountability from the EPA and the Department of Defense?
Well, I certainly hope so, but I am not aware of involvement from the Nature Conservancy. If the person who submitted the question would provide contact information, certainly would love to partner with them.
Okay, Rod, you've got your answer. Get us your information, and Tony and the PFAS Network folks will follow up with you. The Great Lakes PFAS Network. Tess has a question for Tony or Sarah. Do you feel that every U.S. military base is impacted as much as the former Ward Smith Air Force Base was? And that also may need to be a question for Craig, I would say.
Yeah, I would say, well, I'm here at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I work there still in that base today. And there's a group of people just like around Oscoda doing the same thing, and there's massive poisoning in the water, and it's just sitting there, seeping further and further out. And I've heard of many other bases, at least 100, 125 that I know of, that have significant contamination. Whether Wurtsmith is the worst or not, I don't know, but it would appear it's at the top of the list.
Is there any? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sarah.
There are about 650 known military sites where the government has admitted that there is a problem. That's obviously not likely a complete list, but that's where it's admitted. And I would just keep in mind that this firefighting foam was used in training pretty prolifically. We talk about that in the film, that people did not know. People, members of the military who were using it in training did not know it was anything more than soap and water. That's what they were told. It's just soap and water. And so, they had no fear when using it. We also found out that it would alert systems that would spray the foam were very, very sensitive, and sometimes would go off in things like a lightning storm. So, kids would play in it for fun. I mean, it was used, and it was required to be used. There was no alternative that was allowed in any situation where, on a base where there is potentially going to be a fire. So that includes a lot of places, right? And I think, Tony could probably expand on what experts and scientists believe the scope of this to be, but it's we think pretty widespread.
Yeah, I was just say just to follow on that and to talk about Tessa's question in terms of how does Wurtsmith compare to other places. Sarah's exactly right. There are, in her numbers, I think it's actually grown above 700, and they say that there are a few of them where they actually have tested and they don't have PFAS. I'm skeptical about that, but I can tell you all that Senator Gillibrand from New York recently introduced legislation entitled the Filthy 50 Act, and it is aimed at the 50 most filthy, the worst contaminated PFAS, military PFAS sites in the nation. Wurtsmith is in that top 50. And so and may not even be in the upper half of that. I'm not sure. So yes, there are other bases that are very similarly contaminated. What we're also finding is that the Department of Defense has been so slow to test and to take action at these other bases that a lot of information still hasn't been released in terms of the severity of the contamination. They've dragged their feet in a very major way. And so one of the debates that's going on in Congress right now is to try to find ways to push them to actually do more testing at other bases and bring the issue to the fore. And I would say one other thing, this is not limited to U.S. military bases in the United States. There are military bases all around the world where this is happening, and the relations between our government and those foreign cities is absolutely horrible. In Germany, I know that there are real serious problems. There are serious problems in Japan, and the Department of Defense is taking an even more aggressive posture, if that's even imaginable, in the foreign communities than it is here in the United States.
But Tony, can you give us some insight as to why they would stay with this particular process that they know is so toxic and so harmful? What is the motivation? What's driving it at the root level?
Well, that's a real head scratcher. And I think because they've known it's problematic for a long, 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 long time. Common sense would tell you as soon as you found that out that you would take action and you would stop using it. But there is a mindset that pervades the U.S. military that they call this mission critical, and they have been so ingrained in using it that it's a bureaucracy that just can't turn itself around and also can't admit that it made a mistake. It's incredible.
Wow. It's unbelievable. I just can't wrap my head around it. We have a question from Mary, and she is asking, how can we organize in large numbers to write, call elected officials at all levels to bring more awareness to this serious issue?
Well, once again, you start by doing it yourself and talk to your friends and your neighbors, connect with people in your community, and then connect with organizations. There is a group called the National Pfas Contamination Coalition. That is a community-based group, a group of community-based groups all across the country. The Environmental Working Group has done a lot of really great work around this. There are lots of statewide organizations and local organizations as well. And so what you need to do is just start by reaching out to your community, to people who are interested like you, and to elected officials. And Craig, Craig, were you about to say something there?
Yeah, I was going to say that the people that have been harmed by this, tell your story.
Yes.
You really need to tell your story because once the stories start stacking up and piling up, that will have a huge effect.
Thank you for that, Craig and Tony. We have another question, and this one is from a unknown author, but they're asking, are there things that concerned people can do to discourage widespread use of substances with unknown sort of forever chemicals in them? Are there ways that we can be able to inform the public, one, what those chemicals are, what products that are using them, so that people can get more activated and in terms of stopping it?
Yes, is the short answer to that question. There are groups, the Green Science Policy Institute out at the University of California at Berkeley, also the Environmental Working Group, who publish lists of consumer products that are that contain these substances. And they also, particularly the Green Science Policy Institute, works with businesses to discourage them and encourage them to look for other types of chemicals or other types of substitutes for the PFAS substances. So the bottom line, again, is to educate yourself and then call on don't purchase products from people or from businesses who use the chemicals. I mean, that's one way to change the world. And again, just be very, very educated. That's really the best way, to go about it.
Thanks so much. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Okay, we'll go to John. John's question is, are there practical replacements for PFAS use by the Department of Defense, airports, and fire departments?
Well, I can answer a little bit there. The reason why they use this chemical is because they've set specifications on how firefighter foams in general are supposed to put out fires of this type, the oil and gas, and within a certain amount of time. There are chemicals out there that are more organic that can do the job. Probably more research needs to be done on that, and things that are out there ought to be looked at and maybe approved. So it's just about caring. It's about caring about what this stuff is doing, and you put good people on these problems, and they're going to solve it. But that's not what's happening. We got to get people to care first.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would add, and I think Sarah, it's in the film that the European Union has banned PFAS firefighting foam and does use substitutes. The Department of Defense, I was at the National Academy of Sciences in 2018, and the Department of Defense essentially told us then that they have substitutes now that work on land. They're not comfortable with those substitutes for ships that break out on aircraft carriers. And so, the logical response to that is, if that's how you feel, then at least on the land, use the ones that are safer. I don't know where that stands. And I know that there are many people in the scientific community who have informed me that, yes, there are plenty of substitutes. And once again, the Air Force just seems to be, and it's not just the Air Force, the Department of Defense in general seems to be very, very stuck and set in its ways on using these particular formulations. I'd also add that Congress has passed a law that requires that PFAS be phased out in firefighting foam within the next couple of years.
So, Tony, along that same line of questioning, do you know of other products that are potentially sources of PFAS exposure other than fire foam? Because we've gotten several of those questions.
Oh boy, where do we? It's almost like, what is it not in? Sarah, do you want to jump in there? I see you smiling.
Yeah, well, listen, I'm not a scientist, but you Google PFAS in consumer products and you will find a long list of things, from dental floss to the spray that we all put on our carpets in the 90s and our couches so that we could spill whatever we wanted and then clean them up quickly, to the inside of popcorn bags, to the Teflon in many pots and pans, Scotch Guard. I mean, there's a long list, and don't just take my word for it. I think there was a study decades ago at this point where they were studying testing the blood of animals in very remote Arctic regions where there's no human interaction, seemingly would be no exposure, yet they still had PFAS in their blood. So it's pretty much everywhere and in everything at this point. And it certainly is not just because of military firefighting foam. However, what I found very striking in my reporting for this film is that the lack of regulation in this country can pretty closely be tied to the military's role in producing this foam, because there's a hesitation to regulate industry, which would then mean they would have to regulate themselves, right? They would have to, if you're forcing industry to clean up a mess, you're probably going to have to force the largest polluter of this mess. And that is the military. That is the government, right? That's the government policing itself. And I think that's where there have been some failures politically. I think there's pretty good evidence that the military behind the scenes has bullied, in a sense, the EPA and the White House, and kept this from progress. And I think that someone asked earlier why they haven't done something sooner, knowing since the 1970s, at least, that this was a problem. I don't think any of us could really answer the question of why. We can't get into their heads. But I do think that, this whole country is intimately experienced in the last 18 months of this pandemic, that science can be politicized. It can be twisted and weaponized to fit a certain narrative. And I think that there's a degree of that happening here. And I think there is a hesitancy, a cultural problem with many institutions to admit when there has been a failure, and then to move forward from that. I don't know if it's a cost prohibiting problem, given the size of the military's budget and the fact that it pretty much gets what it wants when it asks for it. But it certainly, looks like it could be a daunting figure to actually really do meaningful work to fix this.
Wow. So human lives and casualties are the currency that we're paying for failed leadership. Wow. So we only have a couple more questions left, and I wanted to go to the next one from Joanne. She says, Tony, in your opinion, when will we see PFAS federally regulated in our drinking water? And then she has a second part to that question for you.
Well, Joanne, I don't know. The EPA says they're starting to move to look at regulating two of the thousands of PFAS chemicals, PFOA and PFOS. Those two chemicals are no longer produced in the United States. It's going to be, without federal legislation, I think it's going to be a matter of additional years on just those two chemicals. I know that Congresswoman Debbie Dingell here in Michigan is pushing for legislation called the PFAS Action Act that would jumpstart that. But it's a slow process. And I believe that it's the states who are much better adept at imposing those regulations, adopting them. And as Sarah mentioned, it's the federal government that's the biggest polluter here. So the states are much closer to the issue and much more willing, they have been so far, to take action. So, I mean, I hope that we see action sooner rather than later, but so far, I'm still not optimistic.
But Tony, are there any states that are getting it right in terms of moving in the right direction around regulations?
There are a handful of states that have begun to regulate PFAS. Michigan is one of them. The state of New Hampshire, New Jersey, Massachusetts, there's New York, California is moving in that direction. It's happening, but really, if we're going to attack the PFAS problem, we need to attack the PFAS chemicals as a class. To do it one by one is a ridiculous approach. And I know industry has started a campaign lately saying, trying to say say something to the contrary. But we know that that the chemicals that have been studied are harmful. We know that the family of chemicals are related, and it's time at least for us to say, prove that they're safe before you use them. Don't wait until people have contracted cancers or other immunological diseases and pass it on through the placenta to their children, and then come back and say, oh, well, now we goofed, we better fix it. Address it now. Make sure that that it actually passes safety standards, and then go from there. We still haven't reached that point yet. I would say the state of Maine is probably in the forefront. They've actually taken actions to ban PFAS chemicals in their state, and I think that's a good start. And hopefully, some other states will follow.
Great, thank you for that, Tony. Sarah, you have something?
I was just going to jump in and say, though, that doesn't necessarily mean that the military is abiding by those state laws at those bases. So I think that's an important point. And I also, before I went out as an independent journalist and made this film, I worked in Washington, D.C. for CNN, and I sat in a hearing about PFAS and the potential for federal regulation way before I knew anything about OSCOTA. And it was pretty clear to me that it's going to be a big challenge to try to regulate these as a class. There are thousands of variations of PFAS chemicals, and there's a real hesitancy from some members of Congress, I should say, to blanket regulate them. And what that means is, you've got several thousand of them, right? So every single time one rises to prominence in a consumer product or in products in general, to then have to go and study and debate and then write legislation for it to get out of committee, get to the House, pass the House, get to the Senate, pass the Senate, get to the president's desk, right? Or for the EPA to go through the period of reviewing and public comment and then, enforcing. I mean, think about, times 5,000, right? That's just untenable.
But Sarah, I think that would bring me back to my follow-up question is then, what drives all of you to do this part of this work that you do, you as a storyteller and filmmaker? Because now that we've heard much of the backstory, it still would seem that with all of these political hurdles and all of these blockades and untruths and just flat out lying and poisoning, that this would just make some people throw up their hands. What makes you continue to make these kind of films? And then I would ask Tony and Craig to talk about what makes them, as part of this community, continue to wage this fight, knowing how difficult it is.
Well, for me, it's really about telling stories that haven't been told or haven't been adequately told. Haven't risen to the level of exposure. It's about making sure that as many people um, are getting information, are informed, and are hearing informed stories as possible. So that's always my drive, and that's really why I like these character-driven stories, because I think that they are. Um, sometimes an environmental issues overlooked. And so, that's always uh, my drive. I think that I'm not necessarily, maybe I'm too jaded to be to be discouraged by the fact that I think that we'll see government change on this topic anytime soon, hopefully, probably not, right? But that's not a reason to not tell important stories.
But what gives you hope?
I enjoy seeing people take control of their own narrative, take control of their story, and then and own that and run with it and make meaningful change. And sometimes meaningful change is not, necessarily that they changed the federal regulation or change the laws for everybody, but meaningful change can be meaningful in their community. It can be as meaningful as just letting their neighbors know something that they didn't know about their drinking water before they drink it. So, there are small victories too. And I do enjoy seeing people become empowered by their own stories and use them for progress.
Thank you, Cher. Tony, can you talk a little bit about just in making this film, how has it impacted you and personally, and what gives you hope that it'll address this issue successfully?
Well, I studied government in college. I've been involved in politics in different ways my entire life, and I know that change is often slow. And sometimes you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back and 3 steps sideways. But I have a grandson, and I know that whatever I do, for me personally, is probably, I'm probably too old for it to make much of a difference in my life. But I've been through another contamination crisis in Michigan, the PBB crisis back in the 1970s. My father, Monica, as you know, led the charge to regulate that here. And I was really naive enough to believe that after that happened, that nothing like that would ever happen again. And when I saw this playing out, and I saw this playing out in probably an even bigger and more profound way, somebody's got to do something. And if we all just sit back on our hands and say, hey, this is tough, nothing we can do, nothing's going to change. So it's that old Chinese proverb, I think, that, the 1,000-mile journey begins with the first step. And when I talk to young folks, I remember, Monica, I talked to a group that you had together in Detroit a couple of years ago, and they said, do you think it'll be cleaned up in your lifetime? And I said, no, and maybe not in yours either. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And I think that what gives me hope is that people that I have come to know, first of all, in Oscoda, just amazing and courageous neighbors and friends that I've come to know very, very well, who have been willing to stand up. And then those that I've met in other parts of Michigan, and then other parts of the Great Lakes and other parts of the nation, and frankly, around the world, who are all standing up and saying, wait a second, we need to stop this. We need to move this in a different direction, because we need to leave our planet in a better, or at least move to leave it in a better position than where we acquired it. And that's what drives me. And I think that's what drives my friends and neighbors. And I can't stand it when I see large organizations like the federal government telling really a false narrative, giving people the idea that they have no voice, that they don't matter. That's just not in my DNA to stand up or sit back and watch that happen. So I don't know when it's going to all play out and how it's going to all play out, but we're going to keep pushing and working with people like you and Craig and veterans and all around the country to make sure that we have an impact as best we can.
Definitely. I couldn't have said it better, my friend. And Craig, sir.
I would say that I echo everything Sarah and Tony have said. And I tell you, Carrie and I, um, we would like to prevent the next Mitchell. That's what it's really all about. We're representing our son who never could represent himself. And if we can just prevent one Mitchell from happening, where a young boy will grow up and have a normal chance at life, that would be awesome. And I would tell folks that push against everything that we're trying to get people or be held accountable to clean this up and to take care of this mess, is how many Mitchells do you need us to put up in front of you before you'll do something? This needs to be fixed. It needs people to care, and my hope is always in people. I know that it takes only a small amount of people that care to raise their voice, and it gets louder and louder. And that's my hope, is that people will do that, and this will get fixed someday.
Thanks, Craig. Well, all of you have given me great hope in terms of this fight and the fact that we will win. And so before we leave, just love for each one of you to take a few minutes and close out with any final words or thoughts that you may have. Sarah, can we start with you?
Yeah, mine is really just a thanks to everybody who made this possible. Not just, who participated in the film, some people, risking more than others to talk, and but also to the people who made it possible for residents of Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin to see the film this week. That was really great that we were able to do that. And if you happen to reside outside the state, let us know, and we can figure out a way to get people in your state to see it. It's also available on iTunes, and the equivalent for people who have Androids. Now I can't remember what that is. I think it's Google Play. But yes, just a big thank you to everyone, and great questions from everybody. I love to hear what you guys are thinking. And Monica, you're an amazing moderator. I'm taking notes. I want to be like you when I moderate. So thank you.
You are too kind, Sarah, too kind. Can we go to you, Tony? Can you give us some closing thoughts or remarks?
Yeah, again, echoing Sarah, thank you to everyone who was involved in helping to get this story out. And as everyone was talking here, particularly Sarah a few minutes ago, I think back to a night I was sitting here in my office about 4 years ago. Bob Delaney had given me the reports I talked about a little earlier. And I remember thinking this was a daunting task. I had this information. I was probably the only person outside the government that had it. There were massive ramifications and implications for Oscoda and for the rest of the country. And I remember thinking, how on earth are we going to get this story out? How on earth from little old Oscoda is this going to get amplified? And I was really down. And so sitting in that theater in Ann Arbor and then watching the film again, it almost brings tears to my eyes that first of all, Sarah, again, to you and to Lenny, to your team, thank you so much, really from me and from all of us in Oscoda, for helping us to tell that story and to do it through your eyes. You did such a marvelous job with it. It was a thrill to work with you on it, and it always is a thrill to talk and be on a panel with you. And I guess what I really want to say there's maybe three different groups of people I would want to say something to. First off, to elected officials, because I am a bit of a political animal myself. This is a national health crisis.
Yeah.
And if you choose not to act on it, people aren't going to, in 4 or 5 or whenever it comes home to roost, they're not going to go back and say, oh, well, you made a mistake a few years ago. No big deal. That's not going to be the case. And if you think it's just a crazy old activist like me who's saying this, I would suggest you talk to the CDC. Patrick Bricey the doctor from there has described it as one of the most seminal public health challenges of the coming decades. The Green Science Policy Institute has called it a slow-moving pandemic. This is a serious, serious issue, and they're forever chemicals, and it's not going away. What I would say to scientists is that it was a message I delivered at the National Academy of Sciences a couple of years ago. You need to look outside the laboratory. The guinea pigs aren't just in the laboratory, it's every single one of us in this nation, and particularly those of us like Craig and his family, my neighbors, veterans who've been so heavily impacted. And you can't begin to pretend to study an issue unless you talk to the people who are suffering the problems and get their input and involve them in the process. That is critical, and science can't pretend that this just exists in the laboratory. And lastly, to community folks around the country who are impacted, don't take no for an answer. Stand up and advocate for yourself. You'll be amazed at how successful you can be. It takes time, it takes hard work, but you can do it. And particularly when we work together, we can accomplish a whole lot. So that's my message. And again, thank you to everyone for allowing us to have this platform this evening.
Thanks so much, Tony. To you, Lieutenant Colonel.
Yes, nicely said, Tony. I just want to thank you all, Micah, Sarah, Tony, and everybody behind the scenes who've had everything to do with this. Carrie and I love you all, and we just applaud everything you've done to take this obscure national threat to where it now has a voice, and just thank you. My put is to all the veterans out there. There's a lot of things that have that as we've scattered around and moved around every 3 years to different bases, and we've lost lock on how this chemical has impacted us. You need to get your stories out. You need to tell people that these things that are wrong with you are related, and you just need to start getting into the VA. You need to call your congressman. You need to be active, because there are people that need your activism. So, thank you.
Definitely. Well, I thought I would get through this without crying, but you got me, Craig. I just can't tell you how important this story is. It is so critical, not only to the people of Oscoda, but those military families, the American families. We must get the word out that everybody that you know, please watch this film, share it with your groups, start study groups, start conversations. See if you can get your church to come together and have a deeper discussion about how we don't want to be in a position of no defense. We want to have a defense. We want to have a defense department that's honest and trustworthy and is not poisoning the American public. And so we definitely want to take some time to just express our appreciation to all of our sponsors. I can't tell you how grateful we are for the work of the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network. The Great Lakes PFAS Action Network. Thank you so much. To the University of Michigan, thank you for an exceptional job at M. Leeds Center. To my organization, We the People of Detroit, and to the Great Lakes Now and Detroit Public Television. All of you have been wonderful this evening. And again, we appreciate your time with us. Sorry, one more second, Tony.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that you can still see No Defense online for free through this coming Sunday, August the 22nd. Sarah graciously extended the time period. So I just wanted to make sure we got that out there. I didn't mean to cut you off, Monica, but I wanted to let people know that.
No, that was worth the cutoff. Thanks so much, Tony. And if there's nothing else, and if all hearts and minds are clear, we look forward to the next time that we're all together. But I'll leave you with the words of the Honorable Coleman Alexander Young, who said, if you find a good fight, get in it. Well, the fight for the human right to water is a fight worth getting in.